Monsi contacted me a couple of months ago and asked me to talk about why are we not making more progress to decrease PRRS incidence. And my first thought was, that's surprising, Monsi, because Dr. Connor asked me that same question every morning at 2 a.m. So I'll give you my perspective today. I haven't convinced him that I know why yet, but we'll see if my thoughts are something that you consider to be rational. There's been a lot of tremendous work today. Gordy did a great job this morning honoring Bob. I could not agree more with the summary of Bob's legacy, and that he focused on do work that matters. And you've heard that term so often and so consistent today. And I actually put together my thoughts of Bob's legacy completely independent of that statement, but I think you can see how much of a visionary he was, that he was able to communicate these things to our industry in such a way and that we all listened to that message and heard that one message and carry it forward. And I think nothing really demonstrates what Bob gave to the industry more than the MSHIMP project and all of the legacy of MSHIMP participants that are in this room and at this meeting. And it represents all of the things that you see up on this board. It was collaborative. Bob was easy to work with. For somebody that had no research background, I will bring you no mathematical models in this presentation. That is my promise to you. Bob was very easy to work with because he spoke in layman's terms about how we could solve problems that were important for the producers and ultimately gave us feedback that was actionable, things that could go be implemented, or even better, feedback that told us that we shouldn't go implement something, that it wasn't the most cost-effective technology. Did it work? Yes, but would you make any money doing it? Maybe not. And Bob was very producer-focused from that perspective and was able to build this massive database that has given us a tremendous amount of information that we can use and leverage. The MSHIMP data really gives me two major observations. The first thing that you can see is this massive evolution from an industry that predominantly managed our antibody-positive herds with live virus inoculation or field virus exposure to an industry that now uses predominantly a modified live vaccine to do that. And Bob showed us that really it was more cost-effective to go with a modified live vaccination. And Daniel demonstrated that. Daniel did a tremendous amount of work to publish that information, and producers listened to it and took action on it. I guess before I get away from that, I should highlight one other thing. The other thing that producers heard was that there was value in being antibody positive. So there were some herds over here that had no business being naive because they were going to be infected again in the very near future. And Bob demonstrated a value proposition that we'll talk about in a little bit more detail here in a minute. The other thing that got measured was the industry PRRS incidence. And you can see year over year a cumulative incidence, so the percentage of the sows in the United States that we think see a new PRRS virus. And you see some outlier years. 2011 and 12 was a really bad year. And I don't know if I'm happy or sad to say that I participated a lot in that year, unfortunately. But you see generally a fairly tight trend. And you don't see the recent years being much different than where our history has been. So to make a change, it starts with awareness. This information has made us aware of what our PRRS infection rate is, but it tells us that producers are not making a change that's resulting in a significant decrease in our PRRS incidence. So what are the potential causes of the lack of improvements in PRRS incidence? Number one, it could be that we just can't do anything about it. We have a problem. We know we have a problem, but we can't fix it because we can't prevent PRRS introduction. The other option could be that we have tools and technologies that help mitigate the impact of PRRS infection and that they're getting better all the time. And we're getting better at using them. So we're simply putting our efforts into maximizing the tools we have today to manage the PRRS we have today instead of preventing it. And the last potential cause is some combination of the first two. And that, sure, we can prevent it, but maybe that's not as cost effective as trying to manage the disease outbreak when it happens. And so we'll go through each of these potential causes and try and understand which of these contribute and which of these don't. So I would argue that we have the ability, through biosecurity, to prevent PRRS introductions completely. We have bore studs right along I-35 that haven't broke with PRRS in 15 years. And I apologize, Pete, for making that statement, because I know you're probably getting an email right now. But the reality is we know how to prevent PRRS introduction. PRRS is not magic. We know how to disinfect things for PRRS. We know the downtimes we need, the temperatures we need. We know how to prevent PRRS introduction. We know the critical control points. We know where PRRS wants to come into our herds. And we have the capability to impact every one of these. We can decontaminate feed and water. We can decontaminate the air coming into the facility. We can certainly decontaminate people and supplies and animals. We can test, we can isolate. We have the ability to manage every one of these critical control points. We have a HACCP plan for PRRS. We know how to do it. There are 3 ways you can do biosecurity. You can exclude any of these risk factors from coming in, which isn't very practical, but it works. If the risk factor doesn't contact the farm, it doesn't bring the disease in. We can segregate, so we can get multiple risk factors that live at the herds, multiple pieces of equipment, and they never move from site to site. And it's expensive, but it works. And then we probably rely too much on hygiene and sanitation, but we can do that as well. We can chemically disinfect PRRS, we can use heat, we can use time. There are many things we can do with hygiene and sanitation to decontaminate something. So I want to give my good friend Jim Lowe a lot of credit for coming up with this definition of biosecurity, and it's one that I like to lean on. Jim said that it's a system of barriers that enhance the economic output of independent production units, let's call independent production units farms, by reducing the risk of a novel pathogen introduction. And I think the key part in that is that it enhances the economic output of the farm. If it doesn't enhance the economic output of the farm, it's not a very good investment, and we're probably not going to do it in our production system. I often compare biosecurity to an insurance analogy. I don't have flood insurance on my house because my house doesn't see hurricanes. My house doesn't get flooded when we have a flood in the major rivers nearby. You could offer it to me really cheap, and I might consider it, but at the end of the day, I don't want to pay the insurance premium. I don't have the bad event that often, and therefore I don't need the insurance. And I think farmers look at their farms the same way. Increased biosecurity is going to cost me money. I have to pay the premium of biosecurity all the time. I can keep that money, put it in my pocket, and I have the resources available to live through the bad event when it happens. It's risk management. You can make the decision either way. There's not a right or a wrong answer, but generally you're going to use some sort of a mathematic model to try and figure out what's right for your operation. So we'll go back to this slide. This is a very uninformed opinion on what these biosecurity pieces cost. There is a cost to every one of these steps. Some of them are not terribly expensive, right? We can buy booties for people and stuff like that. There are some relatively cheap things that can be done. Some of them are extremely expensive. If we're going to segregate tools amongst sites, we've got to buy tools for every single site. That's going to cost a lot of money. If we want to invest in air filtration, it's very effective. It's also very expensive. So I think that we have to take a look at each one of these somewhat independently. The other thing that I know from working with farms from literally being built in the last couple of months to being built in the early 1970s is that many of these tools weren't understood when a lot of our production units were built. And the farms that were built in, say, the early 90s are still very good farms, very high functioning and productive farms, but they don't have a lot of the bells and whistles that we would build into a new farm today. So this is my estimate of when a lot of the technologies that we rely on today became available, and not scientifically referenced, so I put a big caveat on that. But if you had a farm that was built in the early 90s, you missed out on a lot of these things that we would build in today. Sometimes you can add that to your facility really easily. Sometimes, no, it takes a big remodel, right? And you've just got to consider all those things into the cost equation. Another pushback that I often get when I recommend biosecurity improvements is the compliance piece. If I'm going to invest in air filtration in my facility, how do I know that my people are still going to take a shower every day? that they're not going to cross the clean and dirty line, that I'm not going to sneak into isolation before I'm supposed to. And this is a set of articles that looked in human medicine, and it was self-reported from doctors and nurses that worked in fairly important parts of the hospital, and this was their self-reported compliance with hygiene. And if doctors and nurses report that they have compliance issues, I think that we have to assume the same thing from our farm employees, from our truck drivers, from our delivery people. We just have to understand that hygiene and sanitation is not going to be implemented perfectly. And that can be a pretty big hang-up for some producers. Why do I want to invest $300 a sow into filtration if I'm going to drag it in some other way? I've got to be able to prevent it completely to make money, and I can appreciate that. I do think that most people are going to look at biosecurity as this risk management continuum, and the value of the farm has to be taken into consideration. So you've got very little disease prevention on one end of the continuum and absolute disease prevention on the other end. And different types of farms fall at different levels. Feeder pig sites are obviously less valuable than boar studs, so therefore your biosecurity investment is going to be different. And even within those, you can make the argument that feeder pig sites that are marketing, I think, Luke, you mentioned this today, if we're within 24 hours of dumping, we can have more risk on those sites, right? There's just not value in pigs in those sites at this point. And so you've got to take that into consideration, and not all farms are going to get the Cadillac biosecurity plan. Your biosecurity investment has to be consistent. This is something that I try and preach over and over again. Do not allow one risk factor to be the open door that continues to allow PRRS to come into your operation when you're making incremental investments somewhere else. And so this is a real life example that I've experienced in farms that I work with, where a producer had made tremendous investment in their wean pig transport and had bought all new goosenecks to go to their sow farms, pick up their sow farms. They had built a transfer station to receive pigs so that they could break the cycle of trucks that would contact the grow finish sites and contact the slaughterhouses, backing directly up to their sow farms. Tremendous biosecurity improvement, right? The odds of these goosenecks bringing disease into the sow farm was now completely mitigated. However, they hadn't made an investment in the maintenance area, and they had one common maintenance truck loaded with tools and supplies that they took to every one of those farms, and would literally go into the truck, grab their tools and supplies, and walk right into the farm with it. So the PRRS virus didn't care how it moved around. And if that maintenance truck went to the grow finish sites, the cycle they were trying to break hadn't been broken at all. Biosecurity is a process, it's a system, it's a chain, if you will, and every link is just as important as the other. I should say some have a little more risk, but the virus doesn't care which mechanism it comes into the farm. So if you're going to make an investment, I think it has to be a consistent one. So to summarize, I think everybody would agree that root cause number one is not correct. We can prevent PRRS introduction. We have the tools to do it. They're expensive in some cases, and you can't implement them haphazardly, so you can't pick one tool out and put it in and expect it to magically fix everything. If you want to truly decrease incidence, you have to shore up the entire system of biosecurity. And some of our older farms just weren't built to make that very easy, or at the end of the day cost effective to do. And we've got to remember that compliance is never going to be 100%. So now let's talk about the potential second root cause, which is we have improving PRRS management strategies. We showed this slide before, and so you've seen this transition now where we have more naive animals in the industry to now less naive animals in the industry. Initially that sounds bad. Well, that means that we have more antibody-positive animals in the industry. And from a production standpoint, that means that the producers can take some value out of that if and when these herds do see PRRS infection. And Daniel did a tremendous job of showing us that value, and you've seen producers respond to it. So in some ways, we haven't really impacted PRRS incidence because PRRS, from this standpoint, isn't costing us as much money as it used to. This comes straight out of one of the scientific updates from last year in the SHIMP. And it was when Carl was doing all the SHIMP data aggregation, and they had just done the initial work on 174 and tried to repeat some of the time to negative pig, time to stability studies. And they had mentioned that 58 of the 61 herds didn't close to gilt entries. And that instantly was an eye-opener to me, because if you don't have an on-site GDU, you don't have many gilts. And after about 8 weeks of chewing through your gilt supply, you're breeding a lot of cull sows at that point that you don't want to breed. And pretty quickly after that, you're just missing breed target. And if you're going to close for 6 months and you miss breed target by 5-10% every single week because you don't have any gilts to breed on, that's a massive cost to the farm. And you can't make that up again. So the opportunity for us to improve the cost of PRRS through maybe letting gilts come into the herd a little bit longer was something that Bob again taught us that we had to consider. We had to take some risk and see if we could get away with that. And I think for the most part, people that have adjusted their strategies and not closed the herds immediately have been pretty happy with the results. We heard today about the processing fluids, and Daniel and Marcelo are working now on family oral fluids as well. But we have better tools to evaluate the prevalence of wild-type PRRS in our piglets in the farrowing house than we have ever had. They're easy samples to collect, they're extremely sensitive, and they help us from a precision agriculture standpoint hone in on exactly when we need to implement McRebel. The Carthage system has done a lot of work on what McRebel costs us in terms of additional pre-wean mortality. And if you go in and you put a rigid stance on McRebel, the day you have the PRRS outbreak, and you say if she has 22 live-born, she stays with 22 live-born, you're going to cost a tremendous amount of pre-wean mortality opportunity to that producer. Through these tools, we can take a look at when are we having pigs born negative, and therefore when do we need to clamp down on those things, and potentially wean a lot more pigs in the meantime. And some people would argue, well, those pigs are going to be weaned with PRRS. The pigs are being weaned with PRRS anyway if they're testing positive on the processing fluids. So I think producers are using these sort of tests to hone in on exactly when they need to put the restrictive protocols in place. And again, we're doing a better job with managing PRRS if better job is defined as the economic outcome for the producer. A couple of other things here. There's been tremendous work done by BI and now Zoetis with their modified live PRRS vaccines to show that we have vaccinations for growing pigs that can help us. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but obviously I think everyone agreed that the growing pig vaccination has been successful to at least to a certain extent for a lot of people. We have macrolide antibiotics that show us a nice impact in terms of decreasing the amount of virus in animals that are infected with PRRS. And there's a really interesting paper that talks about if you can time the antibiotic exposure relative to LVI in this case, but really wild-type PRRS virus exposure, you can have a big impact on abortions and sow mortality. And then several other opportunities listed up here. There are killed vaccines, traditional killed autogenous vaccines. We've got nanoparticle adjuvant technologies that are coming to market, DNA vaccines that are coming to market, and probably one of the coolest things at all, a pig that doesn't get PRRS, that I think everybody is very excited about. So producers see all these things. They see the tools that are available to them. They have limited capital, limited things to invest in, and they say, well, things are probably getting a little bit better. And so I think this root cause is a part of the situation. Our tools and technologies are improving. I absolutely believe that. As much as that, we are getting much better at precisely using our tools and technologies. Instead of saying, no gilts, you're done. For the next 30 weeks, no more gilts. And McRebel, the whole time. No matter what, which I've been very guilty of recommending before, we're getting much better at precisely applying those things and therefore minimizing the unintended consequences of them. There are new tools in the pipeline, and we've got quite a bit of research that's been done to value the tools and make producers aware of the value proposition the tools have. All right, so the last potential root cause, it's really the value proposition, taking the two things into consideration. So what is the cost of the biosecurity? What is the cost of just having PRRS, and is that getting better? How much does it cost me? And I think if you put yourself in the producer's shoes, who's ultimately making these decisions about, do I invest in a biosecurity improvement, I think they very much understand the biosecurity opportunities. I don't think you talk to very many producers today that don't understand that air filtration is an opportunity for them. It is probably pretty expensive, but has been very, very, very effective. They understand the need for all the critical control points we talked about to be controlled. They also appreciate the PRRS cost. They appreciate it way better than I do because they live it. They feel the pain of PRRS, so they're not ignorant to the PRRS problem that they have. I can promise you that. They have tremendously diverse capital options. They can put money into a lot of different places right now. And so I think they're going to look at what is the economic situation that I'm looking at from the improved biosecurity versus just the cost of the disease itself. So up here I use some of Daniel's analysis on the costs of PRRS infection, and this is a couple years old at this point, but we looked at antibody positive herds, what did that cost per sow, and antibody negative herds. And this is predominantly based on the sow farm costs, so it's probably a conservative estimate if you are a wean to finished producer or farrow to finished producer, pardon me. And this, just for an example, you can look at the cost of an intervention. So in this situation, air filtration. The cost is always very easy to calculate. You can go out and get bids and you can figure out how much it costs. For some herds, they can probably filter the farm at a very low cost. For a lot of us further south with curtain-sided barns, it's a little bit of a different story on the cost situation. So the ranges are variable, but it's economic evaluation, so pick what your input cost is and plug it in there and see how much it costs you. The maintenance cost is much more precise. So the maintenance cost would be, we have to replace filters every once in a while. That's the V-banks, that's the pre-filters. We have to do some testing on the filters maybe, and then we certainly have a little bit of an energy cost increase that we have to make an assessment of. And that one is, I think, fairly tight. That one's probably not as wide as the cost of the intervention itself. But so I've got somewhere between $150 a sow and $300 a sow for the initial filtration. That's the cost of everything. Getting the filters, the construction. We have a filtered farm at the end of that investment. And then every year, I should have put that's an annual cost. We're going to add $15 a sow to $20 a sow to the cost of production because we now have a filtered farm that needs new filters, needs more energy, all those costs. And you can plug that in very easily using a spreadsheet. You've got your high cost, your low cost for the intervention. It's actually filtering the farm, maintenance cost in there, and then an outbreak cost. Antibody positive versus antibody negative. You just map out over 10 years how much does this cost you? And I just looked at 4 situations. So a high cost of intervention, so the $300, and then a high maintenance cost, so $20 a year, all the way down to low, $150 for the intervention, and $15 a year for the maintenance cost. And if you look at that, you can see your range is from $300 a sow to $500 a sow. And really, that's generally what you're going to look at in a sensitivity analysis. Because if, as a producer, if you look at this and somebody tells you you should filter the farm, and you look at both ranges of cost, and the outcome still tells you it's a positive outcome or a negative outcome, you don't need to do any more thorough evaluation than that. You know what's the best decision for your herd. Now, you can calculate how often do you have to prevent an outbreak to have a break-even using the outbreak values that we talked about before. Okay? So in this situation, a high filtration cost and a high maintenance cost. If you are an antibody negative herd, you only have to prevent an outbreak once every 4.4 years. If you're an antibody positive herd, that'd be once every 6.8 years. And if you look through the different categories, you can see that we get a range. So you have to prevent an outbreak fairly often in some situations, not as often as others, to justify it. But if your outbreak rate is once every 10 years, and you look at this, you say, I don't really know that I need to spend money on filters. I will keep my $300 a sow to start with, or my $150 a sow to start with this year. I'll keep my $15 or $20 a year in maintenance costs. I'll keep putting that money in the bank account, and then when they break with PRRS, I'll ride it out. I can cash flow that situation because I have cash, and that ultimately is the better way for me to manage the herd from an economic standpoint. So I really think that this last piece is the reason why we haven't seen a change in PRRS incidence. Ultimately, it's not cost effective for some producers. And for a lot of the producers it is cost effective, they've already invested in those tools. They've already made the changes on their farms. I think for some farms, it's just not going to be cost effective to prevent PRRS in all situations. Remember the continuum, right? How much is the value of my production? Am I a commercial producer? Am I a multiplier? The other thing is, we heard it in the seaboard discussion this morning. Producers have tons of options right now. You can invest in a packing plant. That's gone very well for a lot of producers. You can expand and be a part of the group that's going to lay down more sows. And that's been very profitable for a lot of producers. You can take a look at this whole situation and say, I've got enough money in pigs. I want to go put my money in something other than pigs and diversify my overall net worth. And then obviously, we're talking about like capital is always available. Some producers may look at that and say, economically, that's awesome. But I don't have several $100,000 this year to go make that investment. It's not in the budget right now. And that's the reality for a lot of people in a lot of years. So take-homes as I put this together, what I learned from creating this presentation, is that system biosecurity improvements will decrease the PRRS incidence if you take a look at the entire system. So you have to think holistically about your biosecurity system, and you can't make incremental investments haphazardly because you're probably going to spend a lot of money without really changing the outbreak rate a lot. Compliance is really important. Remember at the human medicine survey where they looked at doctor and nurse compliance? So training and auditing remains a key function of what we do as veterinarians. PRRS management tools are improving. And as much as we are getting new and better tools, we are getting much more precise at applying old tools and technologies, old management strategies. And a lot of that, I think, is going to be improved quickly because of the new diagnostic tools that we have. Last but not least, biosecurity is not always cost effective for producers. So you've got to look ultimately is what is the cost of my biosecurity improvements? My cost today and any maintenance cost I have to have that is a new addition to my cost of production. And I have to consider that relative to what's my outbreak rate. And that's a tough projection. We looked at break-evens before. We didn't put in any sort of a cost of capital adjustment. We didn't put some sort of an ROI on it, but a producer is going to want that. If it's break-even, they're not going to make the investment, right? They'd rather keep the cash and have to pay it later. And ultimately, they're going to look at what's the impact of a PRRS outbreak on my herd, and that is, fortunately for producers, gotten better lately.